To the New World Review, your source for everything anime and manga. And today, it's time for action as we explore some of the greatest fights that Hunter x Hunter has to offer. Now, it's kind of weird because despite the fact that Hunter x Hunter does fall into the battle manga category for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really subscribe to standard shonen combat, at least not in the latter portions of the series, but it does still manage to pull off some superb spectacles, often imbuing them with a great deal more depth than standard punchy series would. So it's time to honor those pieces of action here today, with the criteria for this list being fairly simple. First up, we will only be exploring canon Hunter x Hunter material, which mostly means that anything that happened in the movies is not up for contention. Secondly, I guess I should also state that my definition of the word fight is quite broad. It can be generally summarized as an exchange of violence between two or more parties. I just add this because I know the internet can be a bit weird about semantics, so just so you know, we're looking quite broadly here. But with that out of the way, let's begin. Welcome to the top 5 best fights in Hunter x Hunter. Number 5. Adult Gon versus Neferpitou. Alright, we are starting out with one of the most sinisterly epic moments in the series, which was the culmination of Gon's entire character arc during the Chimera Ant story. Seeing him pushed into a situation where his desperation, anger, and sorrow transcended anything most of us will ever know and allowed him to form a deadly vow to summon all of the power he would ever have in order to exact retribution upon a very unfortunate Neferpitou. This is a fight in terms of technicality alone. I'd actually go so far as to describe it as a massacre, and one of the most brutal encounters that this series has ever offered us. It's really strange because viewing it, I am simultaneously elated that Pitou is being finally delivered this sort of justice that they deserve, but there is also this subconscious knowledge that the longer the fight lasts, the more Gon will lose himself and pay an even greater price for the power he's invoked. So even though it's so ridiculously one-sided, it still keeps you on the edge of your seat, but also being a Hunter x Hunter battle, it proves that godlike power can be nigh on irrelevant as Pitou's post-mortem Nen manages to claim one of Gon's arms, which leads to my absolute favorite moment where Gon uses his dismembered arm as a weapon to smack Pitou's corpse all the way back down. And tonally, this fight was a perfect end to Gon's involvement in the arc. It was dark, full of despair, and I think for the first time gave us a proper empathetic bridge into exactly how Gon had been feeling this whole time. It was a very memorable sequence to watch, and one that was so much more than just a simple fight, showcasing how Togashi is supremely capable of entwining greater concepts into action and using combat as a mere tool to portray them rather than using emotion to facilitate the necessity of combat. An absolutely brilliant fight, and one that should go down in the history books for both the anime and manga mediums. Number 4. Hisoka versus Chrollo. So here's a unique one because this battle, to my eternal annoyance, still has not been animated to this day, despite it being one of the most intriguing pieces of action that Togashi has ever put to paper. It's also far from equal, just as with our previous contender, as from start to finish, Chrollo completely outclasses his opponent by displaying the true potential of Bandit Secret in combination with his keen intellect. And there are so many abilities and crazy combinations at play in Chrollo versus Hisoka that it made my mind melt when I first read it. Because not counting Bandit Secret, Chrollo has 6 new abilities to play with, and he very rapidly switches between their combinations, as the readers are left blankly staring at Hisoka and relying on him for an explanation of what's actually happening. But the strategy itself was pure genius, and it's incredible to watch Hisoka be trumped at every step of the way during this battle by an opponent who did nothing but outthink him. It really created a stark contrast between these two combatants. One, a highly strategic and heavily utility prioritized fighter, whilst the other is this more improvised barge into any situation with your 1.5 Hatsu and see where life takes us kind of guy. And this fight showed us the utter decimation of the mindset of the latter, handing a character who for all intents and purposes was invincible up until this point in the story an incredible defeat and even a death. And were it not for Hisoka's own personal lust for life and invoking post-mortem Nen, that would have been the end of him. But instead, what this fight ends up doing is setting up an inevitable round 2 clash where I suspect that things are going to go very differently. And to be honest, the only reason why this fight is not further up on this list is because I haven't seen it animated. Once it is, and if it's done well, then that is an entirely different ballgame. Number 3. Uvogin versus Kurapika. In this fight, we see what I would describe as the ultimate showcase of raw power versus supreme strategy with a dash of revenge added for flavor. For some context, at this point in the series, Uvogin seemed like an unstoppable monster. He was simply too powerful for anybody to take on, or so it seemed. Because this is the fight that would truly introduce us to the possibilities of Nen combat and how there can never be any certainties in battle. Kurapika chose Uvogin carefully as a test subject, viewing him as the ultimate source of raw power amongst the Phantom Troop, a group of individuals that his particular abilities were tailor-made to deal with. As a result, there was no point in this match where Kurapika was in the slightest danger of being overtaken. But it was still an incredible fight to watch because seeing Ufogin in action is quite the spectacle, very reminiscent of a more Dragon Ball style combat, where strength is everything, and he attains quite a serious presence due to that. And then watching Kurapika just walk all over him, that was just, wow, that propelled Kurapika into the stratosphere of respect in my mind. I mean, I said before that there can never be any certainty in end combat, but that's only insofar as you don't know your opponent's abilities. Kurapika analyzed Ufogin, and he was so confident that he even brought a shovel to the battlefield to bury Ufogin's eventual corpse. But like many fights in the series, this wasn't a straightforward action showcase with gratifying results, because even after Kurapika kills Ufogin, we are left with this overwhelming sense of, well, did Kurapika actually win? Because even though he didn't take any standard damage, this encounter thrust him further into the darkness than we'd ever seen him at this point. And he also failed in extracting any information whatsoever from Ufogin. So it was a really bitter victory in retrospect, and I like being left on that lingering sense of, well, I don't really know how to feel about what just happened. Such great mixed emotions generated from a superb narrative and very aesthetically appealing choreography. Number 2. Gon vs Hisoka, Heaven's Arena. So this conflict is what I would pinpoint to be the exact moment in time where I fell for this series. In terms of sheer choreography and adaptation to the animated medium, this stands out above all other fights in the series in my opinion. I can watch the opening exchange of this match over and over and over again, never getting bored and still managing to feel the tension that is crafted so brilliantly with heavy use of a minimal yet powerful soundscape accompanying every hit. It's a real hold your breath moment when this begins and succeeds in drawing you into the action, as if you're a participant of this fight as well. And that is something that is so rare to achieve, even in some of the greatest anime bouts, and the first portion all culminates in a single punch from Gon, at which point the soundscape just cuts in this fantastic beat drop moment, where we as the audience know that Gon has effectively won this fight by being able to take that first step towards Hisoka. That is, of course, despite the fact that he does obviously lose the match, and by quite a wide margin as well. But that really wasn't the point of this. The point was to return the insult that Hisoka had given him during the Hunter exam. I mean, the rest of the fight is also great with Gon being pushed to his limits against Hisoka's Bungee Gamhatsu, but nothing really compares to the glory that is that opening exchange, which will be forever etched in my mind. Although there is one fight that manages to top even that, and I'm sure at this stage, most of you can probably guess what that fight is. Number 1. Netero versus Meruem. So as we arrive at our number 1 fight in the series, I've all of a sudden realized that every conflict we've examined here today has been completely one-sided, and yet still somehow incredibly exciting all across the board. And this fight here is the king of all conflict. Within the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, I can never recall feeling as much hype as I did when Netero first activated the 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva and gave us our first glimpse of what the pinnacle of power in this world looks like. The sheer speed, strength, and intellect that went into this bout is awe-inspiring and incredibly satisfying in terms of its eventual outcome. A lot of the fights I've mentioned so far left me on a very iffy note, which I have praised, but Netero versus Meruem somehow managed to leave me completely satisfied from both perspectives. Meruem because he was able to use complex strategy to take down Netero piece by piece, and Netero because he was able to implement painfully simple strategy to ensure that an end would be put to Meruem by incorporating the poor man's rose into the plan. Everything in between is more or less an exercise in Netero gratifying himself by taking everything he'd ever wanted in life, which was to face off against the ultimate opponent, which resulted in a visual banquet for all of us, especially in the anime. And I really can't emphasize enough just how rewarding it was to see a character like Netero pushed to his absolute limit and showcasing the true potential of humanity, as well as its true terror in the face of defeat. This fight could have a thesis written on it in regards to every aspect it explores, whether it be simple stuff like how to structure a satisfying piece of story with 2 overpowered beings, or something much deeper like an exploration of what it means to be human, and in the end, who personified humanity better, Netero or Meruem, because there is an argument to be made for both, or whether or not they just represent different sides of the same coin. It is absurd that an anime fight can force me into wanting to think on this level, through what is generally meant to be a mostly mindless entertainment-filled exercise. But that is what Netero vs Meruem does for me, and that is why I consider it to be by far the greatest conflict in the series. And that pretty much does it for the top 5 best fights in Hunter x Hunter. If you enjoyed this video and the content